Welcome to the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast. I'm your host, Meta, and in the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast, every week we examine world events and your daily life through the mind of a fighter pilot. The episodes answer your questions harnessing my experience in 25 years of flying fighter jets and my PhD in history, policy, and strategy. You can tune in wherever you find your favorite podcast. You can follow me on Instagram and on YouTube, the Fighter Pilot Professor. All right, welcome to the Fighter Pilot Professor. I am your host, Meta. Glad you're here. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about a sort of an extension of what we've talked about recently, which is Iranian ballistic missiles and drones. And we'll also talk a little bit about kind of, again, an extension of what we talked about recently, the perfect being the enemy of good, right? So as always, you can follow me on Instagram and YouTube, Fighter Pilot Professor. Get this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We'll dive right in. Okay, so recently, obviously, there's been a pretty big escalation in all things that are going on between Iran and Israel, and so I thought I'd talk a little bit about what it is that the Iranians are doing and kind of their capabilities, and I'll talk a little bit about the Israeli missile defense systems as well. So one of the things that happened recently, and even going back to this summer and in previous episodes, we've discussed Iranian and Houthi drones and ballistic missile attacks on Israel and other places. This is an interesting development, in my opinion, right? We've seen drones and one-way attack drones used in the war in Ukraine and all that kind of stuff. But really what we're seeing is sort of like for lack of a better way to put it, a democratization of what used to be the realm of major powers only, right? So like the US and the Soviet Union back in the Cold War were the ones that held the bulk of fancy drones and ballistic missiles and all this kind of stuff, right? China today has a large drone and ballistic missile capability, but the sort of democratization of these sorts of weapons is a little bit different and really has only come into play in the last, we'll say, 10-ish years, last decade or so, a little bit before that, but you get the idea. In the last 10 or 15 years is really where we've seen it. In the first place, we saw there's been drones in war for quite a long time in various different capacities. There've been ballistic missiles, all the way back to World War II. The Germans the Nazis had, the V1 rocket, which was essentially a one-way attack drone, and then the V2 rocket, which was a ballistic missile, right? So going all the way back that far, these kind of tools have existed, but they were expensive to produce. And with obviously the cheapening and distribution of easier access to things like GPS, smaller and lighter and more advanced computing, right? You think about how much power you're carrying around in your iPhone, right? But that's just this tiny little package. It's got GPS. It's got all kinds of fancy, systems in it, right? Same idea here. And we're just seeing this like cheapening technology that's increasingly getting in the hands of, in this case, the Iranians, right? And they're using this technology to build ever smaller and ever more ballistic missiles that have a really large capability. So this particular diagram here is a depiction of Iranian homemade ballistic missiles. Some of the Iranian ballistic missiles originally came from the Soviet Union, but this diagram shows us their sort of homemade ones. And what you can take away from this diagram is that they have a range of missiles that can reach out anywhere from just across the border into places like Saudi Arabia and Iraq, all the way out to essentially the central Mediterranean and up into Turkey. And they're working on getting systems that can go even further than that. And they have a pretty robust arsenal of these systems, right? Depending on when you took count and who's counting, right? A few thousand, sort of at a minimum. And they've also exported this technology to their proxies, right? So the Houthis have some of this technology. They have the smaller, shorter distance versions of these smaller ballistic missiles. And these have a fairly a small payload, but nevertheless, if you can produce them in great numbers, then they can be very lethal, right? Their larger ballistic missiles are also very capable, and this is what we've seen them fire at Israel, these larger ballistic missiles that carry a heavier payload and potentially could carry nuclear weapons should they be able to develop such things. And that's really the sort of primary threat that the Israelis are facing, right? The other threat, and we've talked a little bit about it, is these one-way attack drones, Shahed 136 one-way attack drones. These are basically like, give or take, you can see in this diagram, they're roughly, 10 to 15 feet long and 8 or so feet wide, sort of delta shaped as we call it, and it looks shaped like a triangle, for lack of a better way to put it. And they have about a 50 horsepower motor, and they can carry various things, but usually they're meant to fly on a pre-programmed course using GPS and other things to navigate to their target and explode their small payload, right? These things are obviously sort of the opposite of a ballistic missile. The ballistic missile goes high up into the atmosphere and comes down, hence ballistic. But these are powered all the way to their target. So they, like a little tiny airplane, they cruise all the way to their target and then attack it there, right? So these are the primary weapons that the Iranians are using to attack U.S. forces in the Middle East, that the Houthis are using to attack their within the Yemeni civil war. They're also attacking the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Israelis as well. And they're also using these to attack ships, not just warships, but commercial ships in the Red Sea as well. So these are the weapons, and frankly, they're prolific. They're reasonably cheap to make, and they're way more accurate and deadly than ballistic missiles of yore were. On the other hand, we got the Israelis have the what's typically called the Iron Dome system, and the Iron Dome is not one thing, but actually several things. And these are surface-to-air missiles and other guided missiles, radar-guided missiles that can intercept the Iranian ballistic missiles at very high altitudes, so basically on the edge of space, like 60 miles in the air, and very long ranges. They also have sort of an inner, so that might be like the outer bubble, right? They have missiles that can reach very high altitudes and very long ranges to intercept ballistic missiles. And then they have this sort of lower, closer in defense system to shoot down rockets. For example, we've seen Hezbollah and Hamas both use rockets into Israel, and they have these systems that are both missiles or smaller missiles, rockets, if you will, counter-rocket rockets, and also sort of cannons, machine guns, if you will, that shoot down the incoming rocket rounds, mortar rounds, or these small one-way attack drones. So it's sort of this, if you will, cat and mouse game between the Israelis and the Iranians as to how they are shooting back and forth. But it's really interesting to me that the Iranians have really proliferated this, and they have a very wide arsenal, and they're ever expanding. So it'll be this ongoing tit-for-tat conflict, in my opinion, between the Israelis and the Iranians around these one-way attack drones and use of ballistic missiles by both the Iranians proper and their proxies. All right, as you know, you can follow me on Instagram and YouTube, the Fighter Pilot Professor, and you can get this podcast wherever you get your podcast. Okay, so in previous episodes, we talked about the fast, good, and cheap rule, right? And we've talked a little bit about, doing your best and all kinds of stuff like that in the past. And today I want to talk a little bit about the idea of perfect being the enemy of good, or good enough, right? And for those of you that are like me and we like to do a good job, we will often spend a lot of time making sure that we've done that good job, right? And sometimes you can kind of overdo it, right? There's trying to achieve perfection, right? And what ends up happening is, in trying to achieve perfection, you sort of undo what could be good, right? And so in the last episode, we talked about the fast, good, and cheap rule. And like, if you think about it, if I'm on a time crunch and I need to turn something in, if I'm continuously pushing it to be absolutely 100% perfect all the time, right, as best as it possibly can be, I can get in this loop of endlessly revising, and I will never meet my deadline. Right. So I need to like learn when is it good enough, right? Like, when is this product good enough and it's going to be sufficient for what I'm trying to do, right? Similarly, right, in your daily pursuits and other things that are beyond work, right? Like, if I'm always trying to achieve this level of success or perfection, if you will, I can be taking away the enjoyment of the thing, right? So if you like to get out there and ride bikes for fun and exercise, right, the striving to always be better, faster, win, etc., can get in the way of that joy of doing the thing that you're trying to do, right? So that's when perfection can get in the way of good, right? And so there's sort of this endless number of ways where, like, if I'm trying to do good, and I'm trying to do my best, then that's a good thing to achieve. But at some point, right, there's this like point of diminishing returns, and I have to recognize that, hey, if I'm going to spend this much capital on this thing, it may actually end up costing me more than it's worth. It may cost this joy. It may cost this time, right? I may violate the fast, good, cheap rule, whatever. I may miss a deadline. There's a bunch of things, right, that if I could always striving for perfection, I could miss good, right? And, you know, there's a bunch of different things that you can do to overcome that. One of the things is obviously like practicing the thing that you're doing, and you'll get better and better, right? The other thing is making sure to give yourself enough time if you can, right? The old fast, good, and cheap rule, right? If I can give myself a little more time, then I can go diligently through my work, and then I can find it completed in a timely fashion, because I have a little bit of time to work on the thing, and that will help me feel more secure about that, right? So usually when I'm pressing perfect over good is when I'm time crushed, right? And so that's typically when these kind of things happen. So if I give myself a little more time, then I may be better off in the end, right? And the other thing you can do, right, is set up some habit patterns, right? Or make things that are a little more executable. If I can do things in a way that sort of are habitual and easily executable for me, then I know I can get a rhythm down on doing a task or whatever it is. And that will help me develop that skill and be good and more proficient at it. And that by extension will make you better. So there's some things that you can do to sort of make good enough. And you don't have to strive for that perfection, right? So I hope that helps. Keep shooting me your questions and topics to discuss. As always, you can follow me on Instagram and YouTube, the Fighter Pilot Professor, and throw your questions up there. Have a good one.